transparency is the most important single thing. And not because I think it's a silver bullet.
Like education would probably be something at the forefront on all levels.
A pharmacy benefit manager. They are basically middlemen between manufacturers and...
Middle people.
What's that?
Middle people.
Middle people.
So welcome to another episode of RX Revolution. We're going to be talking about some interesting stuff, drug costs and PBMs. Here with us today, we have Dr. Joyce and Dr. Lakdawalla. Can I have you guys give a brief introduction, tell everybody who you guys are?
Sure. My name's Darius Lakdawalla. I'm the Quintiles Professor of Pharmaceutical Development and Regulatory Innovation at the School of Pharmacy, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Schaefer Center for Health Policy and Economics.
And I'm Geoffrey Joyce. I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Pharmaceutical and Health Economics here in the school, and director of health policy at the USC Schaefer Center.
Very cool. So the topic that we're talking about, again, is PBMs and drug costs. It sounds a little serious. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, can you guys give us any fun fact, fun information that you've encountered or experienced in your pharmacy career?
I wouldn't say fun is the first word that comes to mind, Melissa.
Well, whatever you want to share.
Well, I think that the way that I always explain PBMs is that it's kind of like a real estate agent. So you need some help negotiating the price of your house, and you don't want to do it yourself, so you hire a real estate agent. The problem with real estate agents typically is you don't always know whether the real estate agent has your best interests at heart.
Oh.
Sometimes they just want to get the house sold or bought, and they just want to move on to the next client. Anyway, I'm not suggesting that the analogy goes all the way, but this problem of incentives is a familiar one to the PBM context as well. That's the best I can do for fun.
Okay,
Is like the
all right,
real
that's
estate
fair. That's
analogy.
fair. Thank you.
I'll take a little shot. We used to have people come in and talk, generally academics, but also from industry. And those who come in from the PBM industry think they've drunk the Kool-Aid. They think they are basically constraining these greedy drug manufacturers, and they're bringing low costs and saving consumers and improving the health of the population. They really seem to believe that story.
And I'm assuming that that's not necessarily the case.
They do lower drug costs, but they keep too much.
Okay.
That's the bottom line.
I mean, they do. That they're producing some benefit, but just like every other member of the for-profit ecosystem in the pharmaceutical industry, they're acting in the best interest of their shareholders. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to understand what that means for their decision-making and how we think about public policy.
Okay. So before we get started, I know we kind of had the topic, the conversation started already. What is PBM? For us that don't know, what does that actually mean?
A pharmacy benefit manager. They are basically middlemen between manufacturers and...
Middle people, Jeff.
What's that?
Middle people.
Middle people.
Yeah.
Between manufacturers and health plans or employers, plan sponsors as we call them. When you think about in the old days, particularly with medical services, you would go to a doctor or a hospital, they would get a service 2 or 3 months later, they bill your insurer, the insurer pays. You needed a different type of a system. You needed real-time adjudication. So when you show up at the pharmacy, they know what your coverage is and your benefits and how much you have to pay out of pocket, whether you have other drug interactions, things of that nature. So there was a different way of handling prescription drug claims versus medical claims. And that's how this industry was born.
And how have PBMs evolved over the years? How do they fit in the healthcare system?
Well, they were originally designed, as Jeff said, to help make sense of what is an incredibly complicated industry. Employers in particular don't want to spend their time figuring out how to design pharmacy benefits, how to negotiate drug prices, because they all have their own jobs to do. And it's unreasonable to expect a company that is, selling gasoline to figure out the vagaries of the prescription drug industry. And that function remains. The issue is just that over time, the PBM industry has become more concentrated, which in economic parlance just means you have fewer and fewer firms controlling more and more of the market. And as that happened, they have more ability to influence prices and potentially more ability to retain profits because there's less competition in that segment of the market. At least that's the conceptual implication of less competition typically.
Okay. And I mean, every time I talk about, or rather bring up the topic of PBMs, people just look disgusted. They don't necessarily have a good reaction. Why are they the hated, or I mean, I guess for lack of a better word, the most hated group? Like, why that reaction?
I feel like everybody is hated in the pharmaceutical industry. Though. It's hard. There's a horse race going on here but I think there's a lot of unpopularity for reasons that Jeff, I think, can best explain.
I think they're the secretariat of the industry. They sit at the center of this hub. They have proprietary or private contracts with manufacturers to negotiate lower prices. They have proprietary contracts with pharmacies of how much they're going to pay them. And then they have proprietary contracts with plan sponsors, let's say USC, a large employer. And so as a result of that, they're in the center. Everyone feels as if, I don't think my PBM is being fair, but I don't know how they're cheating me. But there's this sense of, I know they're retaining too much. It's very hard to document and prove what they're doing. And we know, as Darius said, they do serve a valuable purpose of group purchasing, right? That's what they do well. They negotiate on behalf of millions of people to get lower prices. And they'll always argue the world would have higher drug prices in the absence of a PBM, which is absolutely true. But again, because of this opacity and lack of transparency and private contracts with different groups, they retain too much.
And you were talking about group pricing. Can you elaborate on that? Like, what exactly is that?
Well, the largest
group purchasing. Sorry.
Well, as Darius had mentioned, that there's been consolidation. So we have 3 real large PBMs that dominate the marketplace. They may represent 60 to 80 million covered lives. So when they go to manufacturers and play one drug off of another within a therapeutic class, they have lots of leverage to say, if you don't give us a big price concession, you could lose access to this large group of consumers. So by aggregating consumers, they're able to negotiate and leverage that sort of market power to get lower prices.
So, I mean, we all love like lower prices. We don't like paying, especially when it comes to medication, what is it in addition to the lowering of the drug costs, or what other positive things come out with PBMs and besides just lowering drug costs?
Well, so I think it's worth actually underscoring the point about drug costs, first of all, that net prices paid for pharmaceutical, meaning prices net of all discounts, have actually been pretty stable or falling over the past 10 years.
Okay.
People are very surprised when they learn that, and it's not a controversial number. These are government statistics that are pretty well documented, but it seems like that there's a perception of prices rising. And part of the reason for that problem is that there has been additional money flowing to PBMs, but they are doing something valuable, which is why they're still around. They're taking a lot of this burden away from employers who otherwise would have to spend time and effort figuring out this morass of an industry. Maybe that's not the best word. It's a very complicated industry, and it's very complicated to figure out how to negotiate prices. I will say one thing about prices is that declines are always good in the short run, but in the case of pharmaceuticals, you don't want to drive prices down in a manner that discourages innovation. So new drugs that are very valuable should be rewarded as such, and that's something that doesn't always happen under the PBM system. So there's a balance here. There's clearly some benefit. There's clearly some issues that money is flowing to PBMs in the form of profits because of their market power. But we have to figure out how to harness the good and mitigate some of the bad.
And you were talking about that balance. Can you talk more about that balance and what that means for innovation? How do PBMs provide the ability for innovation to happen with lowering or increasing the drug costs?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, so in principle, what you want is a system where valuable drugs get paid more and less valuable drugs get paid less.
Okay.
It sounds very simple and obvious, and it's the way that most markets for innovation work when consumers are doing the buying, because consumers aren't going to pay more money for a product they like less, generally. The problem is that in the pharmaceutical marketplace, consumers don't really have a direct seat at the table when it comes to setting prices, or even sometimes when it comes to making purchasing decisions. They don't always have the ability to choose, and they're not even necessarily in the best position. They don't have the medical information. They don't necessarily pay all the cost. So for all these reasons, that process gets distorted, and you can't rely on the market in general in this setting to produce prices that are linked with value. That's sort of a separate problem than PBMs, but it's important to bear in mind that pricing is uniquely impactful in the pharmaceutical industry. It's not just about who gets treated today, it's about who gets treated tomorrow. What's going to happen to our kids and grandkids is very much at stake in terms of today's pricing discussions.
But if I could follow up on that, I think one criticism of the PBMs, which is somewhat valid, is they don't really have a lot of financial risk. They're basically middlemen in between manufacturers and health plans. So if a population spends too much on prescription drugs, it doesn't generally come out of their pocket. They don't innovate very much.
Okay.
They're not taking financial risks. So the belief is the rewards, their economic profits that they're earning aren't quite equivalent to the risk they're taking. On the converse, think about manufacturers. They invest $1 billion, $2 billion to develop a drug that may or may not be successful, and there are competitors out there. There's real money at financial risk, and you, as Darius said, you want to reward that innovation. So I think sometimes when people see aggregate net profits, let's say within the PBM industry in the upper 20s, almost $30 billion a year, they say, that seems disproportionate to the value they add.
And so when you talk about the consumers and them, essentially not being a factor, is it important? Like, what would be the benefit of actually factoring in the people that are actually purchasing these drugs?
So it is a complicated problem. There's no simple solution to this problem. That's something that we should all be clear about. But the importance of bringing patients and consumers to the table in some fashion is that ultimately value is about the benefits to patients. And that's really the sum total of it. And so excluding patients from the conversation around pricing will necessarily result in prices that don't reflect value. Now, the good news is that to some extent, there is a relationship between price and value, because insurers, employers, and even PBMs themselves do care about some important aspects of value to patients, like how effective is this new drug we're looking at? How much better is it than other drugs? Those do matter. We'd like to see them matter more, and there certainly are particular circumstances where they don't really seem to matter very much at all. But there's something to work with there. So I think we shouldn't overstate either the problems or the benefits. That this is just about finding ways to improve the functioning of a market that is very complicated, and I would say in some ways unnecessarily complicated.
And so let me see if I'm understanding. So consumers essentially would fight for everything to kind of be cheap, and then that would severely affect the drug costs and then the ability for innovation. Well,
so think of a similar market, smartphones. Okay, this is another market that's driven by innovation. The difference is that in the market for smartphones, you don't have intermediaries setting prices, really.
Right.
You have consumers directly facing prices and deciding, do I want to buy the new iPhone with the bigger screen and the fancier camera for $1,000? Or would I rather buy the last generation for $600 or $500 or whatever my carrier is offering me in terms of a discount? And given that discipline, Apple and Samsung and Google and all the other handset makers, they're innovating, but they have to ask themselves, is this really worth it? And if the answer is yes, then they'll do it and they'll price it accordingly. And consumers may not like the fact that the iPhone, they may prefer the iPhone to be $500 instead of $1,000.
Absolutely.
Right? But if it's offered to them for $1,000 with the fancier camera and it's worth it to them, they'll buy it.
I'll take it.
and they'll buy it. They'll feel like, they're getting a reasonable enough deal. And they're also encouraging this kind of innovation that benefits them. because now the handset maker is going to think hard about how do I make this phone more attractive so people will pay me more money?
Okay.
And in that case, the market incentive gets harnessed for patients, in this case consumers, gets harnessed for consumers instead of working against them so heavily.
I see. So essentially, I mean, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there are a couple issues in prescription drugs and medical care more broadly that we don't want consumers as actively involved as they are in other types of markets. Right? First of all, they have insurance.
Yeah.
So if you're cost sharing the differential between sort of one drug and a higher cost drug that may be substantially higher in cost, may be trivial to you as far as a copay differential. So you may prefer the more expensive drug because it only costs you another $20 copay, but it may cost your health plan another $1,000, which implicitly ends up in your premiums. Secondly, we don't expect people to be able to make wise medical decisions broadly, but prescription drugs in particular. You should have an agent. That's why you cannot go generally unless it's over the counter. You can't purchase a prescription on your own. And so we think those decisions should be made on a clinical basis by physicians with some, obviously, parameters. And I think what PBMs try and do is nudge doctors and others to prescribe maybe more cost effectively or in some cases suspiciously in ways that are beneficial to the PBM. And I think that's where there's some suspicion and resentment at times.
I see.
But individuals are limited, and that's what we've seen as proliferation of advertising is to try and get consumers more involved in, hey, doc, I'd love Jardiance. I don't have diabetes, but give me Jardiance.
Oh, wow. That's so interesting. It's very odd that would be kind of like that drive or even factored in on a whole. I kind of want to take a step back. We were talking about innovation. What is that? What do you guys mean when you talk about innovation as it relates to PBMs and drug costs?
So when we talk about innovation as economists, we're typically referring to the discovery of new drugs.
Okay.
The launch of new drugs, they may be new formulations or dosing regimens, any improvement or alteration in the way drugs are developed or administered. That's what we mean.
And what actually funds the research or funds the innovation in this regard?
High drug prices.
Okay.
Basically, as Darius said, you don't want them too low. You want to reward innovation.
So why isn't this on general public knowledge? Would it be beneficial for this information to be out there so that we as consumers and patients and buyers understand maybe why these drug costs are so high? Because I know especially patients, they shy away from even calling their insurance company because it's a headache, or even looking at their insurance plan because many times they don't understand it. And for myself too, I'm looking at my drug plan and I'll see this is covered or this is covered, and sometimes I'm just at a loss.
So here's, I think, the challenge we all face with communicating this, because I agree with what you're saying completely, that there is a communication gap here. But here's the problem, that typically what we find is that new drugs have been incredibly valuable on average. That they've brought a ton of new value. Think about some of the major breakthroughs we've seen for leukemia, for HIV, for hepatitis C. These are drugs that have truly changed the lives and given life to people who face death sentences or other kinds of significantly debilitating diseases. So there's all this value. The problem is that there invariably are cases where a drug is manufactured for $1, sold for $100, because maybe in fact the average value is $150. But there might be people out there who derive, let's say, I'm making up numbers, but who derive $50 of benefit, and they don't get it at the $100 price. But they could benefit because their benefit is so much higher than the cost of producing this drug. That's the idea, that you're leaving a lot of value on the table with high prices. Now, insurance is supposed to solve for that because it gives consumers access to low copays while still providing drug manufacturers with prices that are in line with value. That's the idea. And in some cases that works. The consumers get access to very, very valuable drugs that command high prices, but they're getting those drugs at very low copays. That's actually ideal.
Yeah.
What you don't want to have happen is drugs that, as Jeff is alluding to, that aren't very valuable, for one reason or another, are benefiting others in the supply chain and other than patients, and those are getting driven up in utilization. That's a bad outcome.
Okay.
And that's something that we want to avoid. And we want to avoid the situation where patients are denied access to drugs that benefit them as well.
So what can we do? Because I feel like a lot of times we're like, the insurance companies suck because the prices are so high. My copay is $1 million. I have to pay $240 for a medication I need for 3 months, and I can't not go without it. How does the insurance companies and PBMs correlate, and how can we change how we get more positivity or more value out of what we're selling?
Jeff has a 3-point plan that I'm going to
Well, as Darius alluded to at the beginning, pharmaceutical manufacturers, PBMs, insurers are generally for-profit companies.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Looking to say, how do I return value to my shareholders? Not necessarily to discover life-saving drugs or get the drugs to needed patients at the lowest cost. It's how do we make money?
Okay.
So there is some inefficiency and waste in the system because of the profit incentive. And these companies, all of them do things which we may say are unethical, but they're making money for their shareholders. And so that financial incentive, I think, drives innovation, but also has a downside that we have to try and check. And I think there's been discussion of, for example, PBMs don't have to act in the best interest of their clients by law. Right. So generally when Fidelity or TIA, CREF, or Vanguard manages our retirement plan here at USC, they are a fiduciary. They have to act in the best interest of USC.
That makes sense, yeah.
PBMs have one in court that they do not have to act in the best interest of their clients, and they don't always. So they may, again, by their broad scope and leverage can reduce drug costs quite a bit. But they're looking out for themselves as well.
Yeah.
And so they may design formularies that are more beneficial to them than necessarily the members. And that's the frustration I think people face is, why is this drug not covered? Why is this generic not covered and I have to get the brand?
I see.
Because maybe the brand has a large rebate that can be somewhat retained by the PBM. So there's some suspicion and frustration that it doesn't work as efficiently or as equitably as it should.
One issue with the current system we have is that the actual price paid for drugs is totally unknowable by employers, even large employers. There was a very well-known case, I think it was about a year ago, where Tyson Foods, right, the big chicken manufacturer, huge company, they could not get their PBM to answer a simple question about how much they were paying for Humira, which is one of the biggest selling drugs in the world. This is not a squirrely drug that it would be hard to figure out. But the PBM said, no, we're just not going to tell you. And so Tyson switched to a smaller PBM, and they made an announcement about it. And the point is not that this is going to get solved by a few companies switching from one PBM to another, but it's to illustrate that even powerful employers, large powerful employers, don't know what they're paying for drugs. And so if we want a system that is efficient, where people are paying prices that meet value, when they're paying for value and not paying for drugs that are not valuable, how the heck can we expect that to happen when no one knows what they're paying? Yeah. And that's a big issue, that there needs to be more transparency for employers, patients, consumers, all of us, basically, into what we're really paying for drugs.
Well, a part of the legal process about them not being able to have a responsibility, is that a part of the reason why they don't have to tell you how much these drugs cost?
Yes, and PBM contracts, if any have seen them, are very complicated. And as Darius said, even sophisticated purchasers really can't see between the bottom line. And they'll typically, I think the game that is played, and it's industry-wide, it's not just the PBMs, is there are discounts off of this fictitious list price, this average wholesale price, maybe a wholesale acquisition cost. So there's some fictional list price, and then there are rebates or discounts or concessions off of that. That's proprietary information. So as Darius said, no one really knows who's paying what, how much pharmacies are being reimbursed versus how much the employer is being billed for that same drug. So this opacity or lack of transparency, I think, is at the root of a lot of the waste in the system.
And so if we were to fix that problem, what would that look like?
We have no idea what that would do,
Okay.
really, honestly, because this is an unfortunate fact, but there's no analog in history for what happens when you take a system that is so opaque of this magnitude and scale, and make it more transparent. There are a few examples of very different kinds of industries, but the pharmaceutical industry is quite different. So my preface is we don't exactly know. However, I think, based on sort of economic theory, which I think is relevant here for sure, that a more transparent system would get us less waste, as Jeff alluded to. And it's a very commonsensical argument. How can you expect people to make efficient decisions, i.e. without wasting money, when they don't know what they're spending?
Yeah.
I mean, it's as if I asked you to go into the grocery store, shop, and then at the end of the trip, I only told you your total bill. How would you make decisions
You
in
wouldn't,
the grocery? You wouldn't. But that's literally what employers are having to do. They know their total bill at the end, but other than that, they're sort of in the dark.
That seems not efficient.
I think transparency is great if we can get there. I'm a little pessimistic. The PBMs have evolved over time. So there was lots of concern about, hey, they're retaining too much of these rebates, and rebates are price concessions or discounts. And so third-party firms started to advise people like us, say, hey, ask for 100% rebate pass-through, right? So by contract, the PBM would have to pass through the rebates. They just pivoted quite nicely and said, fine, we'll call it an administrative discount or a disease management program. So again, they have, because of the lack of information and transparency, they can basically evolve and move revenue streams different ways. In addition, they've evolved by now they own specialty pharmacies and mail order pharmacies where they kind of move business towards their own facilities.
Okay.
So they make money in that way. So they're very clever and smart.
Absolutely.
And so when you squeeze the balloon one place, they make money elsewhere.
Oh,
so
my
I'm a little more
goodness.
pessimistic about, we're going to, that they won't respond well. I guess the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, is what sort of Congress passed to say, hey, Fidelity and other health plans, or when you represent employers like this, you have to act in their best interest legally. If you put PBMs under that, a lot of these problems go away, right? If they don't have incentives, they're paid a flat administrative fee, and if they're efficient, there could be incentives built in of rewarding a more efficient PBM or a better PBM. But you take away all of their incentives to cream skim and to take stuff off the top.
And they can't squeeze you.
And they can't squeeze you.
Yeah.
But again, that would take an act of Congress to say, PBMs, you are now under ERISA.
But how come they are able to act so, I mean, I wouldn't say outside of the law, because the law is essentially telling them that they can do all these things. But why is it, how come there's no guidance, there's no more like stricter regulations on what they're able to do so that we can have something like that?
I think part of the reason is what Jeff alluded to, that it's really difficult to legislate behavior. And that's true for companies and for people.
That makes sense.
And, the fact is that we get whatever we incentivize, as a society. And I think the issue is that we've incentivized opaque pricing behavior. I agree with everything Jeff says about like the possibilities of, companies staying a step ahead of regulatory changes. I guess I'm a little more optimistic because I think that if there were movements towards transparency, it actually could become a competitive lever for some PBMs to say we're going to be particularly smaller PBMs, and they're already kind of doing that without regulatory stimulus to do it, saying we're going to be transparent. It's kind of like what Mark Cuban has been doing on the pharmacy side of being very transparent about costs in their pharmacy provision. And people appreciate that.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
been
valuable.
his big marketing push that
Right.
like we're going to be honest with you about what these drugs cost, and I see the appreciation by the consumers because of it. You know, I feel like he might actually succeed maybe more than Amazon or another chain pharmacy that's selling those same drugs.
That's the hope that I have is not that we as academics or government will outsmart industry in figuring out how to prevent them from doing what they think is financially beneficial, because that's a losing proposition. But what I am more optimistic about is that if we open up this avenue of competition, then you're moving the ball downhill finally. And you're creating a competitive incentive to be more transparent and to give people insight into what they're spending and how they ought to be spending their money better.
Yeah.
And that's an issue I think Darius raises that's a good one is we've seen consolidation within the PBM industry, the three big PBMs dominating the market, and that leverage does give them more negotiation to get lower prices.
Absolutely.
Okay. In addition, they have now vertically integrated, which means they're generally owned by large insurers as well. So Optum PBM is now owned by United Health. CVS is with Aetna.
That almost feels like it should be illegal.
So in essence, they've locked up a patient population. So if you are a United Health plan member, you are going to use their PBM.
Yeah.
And that stifles competition. So you say, why aren't these independent or transparent and sort of more lower cost in theory PBMs making inroads in the market? It's tough.
Some of the irony, it is kind of ironic that PBMs were originally conceived of by drug companies, but they were forced to divest those PBMs because there was the fear of vertical integration on that side that they said, well, drug companies can't own an organization that's trying to design benefits, but why is it so much better for health insurers than or potentially pharmacies,
It's not. At least I don't think so.
I think there's an argument to be made that it's actually pretty similar in that vertical integration. It's a complicated issue, but I think there's a question that needs to be carefully addressed. Is that vertical integration something that needs to be mitigated? And I think that's something that we need to take a hard look at.
I kind of have an understanding of when you use the term vertical integration, but can you be more specific about what that is?
Sure. When you think about, we talked horizontal integration is PBMs buying up other PBMs.
Okay.
So you're buying up competitors along a sort of a horizontal level.
Got it.
Now we're seeing vertical integration where a medical insurer is buying up or is merging with a PBM. So you control both the medical insurance side and the pharmacy side. And in the case of, let's say, for example, CVS Caremark, they are part now with Aetna, large health insurer. They have CVS Caremark, a large PBM, and they have retail pharmacies, which treat patients in both drugs and in minute clinics. So in essence, they claim there are real efficiencies and economies of scale by integrating into one company.
Yeah.
But it creates a lot of market power. And again, if you are an Aetna insurer, your employer signs up with Aetna, you know now where you're going. You're going to get CVS Caremark as your PBM, and you're going to get discounts and incentives to go to CVS pharmacies.
Yeah.
And that lack of, I think, competition over time can lead to higher prices over time.
And so when we talk about the more transparent PBMs, the ones that are probably lesser known, what can we do, or I mean by we, but like what can be done in that situation to kind of help them become one of the bigger PBMs? Because the fact that there's only 3, that's a little scary.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I do think a couple things. I think Jeff's point about fiduciary rules is worth careful consideration. That it's not a controversial idea in the financial services industry that institutions like, as Jeff mentioned, retirement, savings, banks and such, that they act as fiduciaries. It's reasonable to imagine that a PBM should act as a fiduciary.
Okay.
And I think that's one aspect of this. And why would it affect this outcome about transparency? Well, I think it brings to the fore the issue, first of all, and it probably creates some behavioral change on its own. It creates a strategy for new entrants to say, you know what, we're really committed to this fiduciary responsibility, and we're so committed that we're going to give you more transparency into what we're doing. I think on the other side of this, more requirements for reporting prices would be helpful. I think Jeff's point applies here, though, which is that, you know, it's always easy to come up with creative ways to change what you report. But at the same time, it's some data that's probably valuable. It gives you some insight. It's better than no data, for sure. And it moves the ball in the right direction. It might not score a goal, but, you know, at this point, the question is, how do you get the ball moving in the right direction and put the emphasis on these issues like fiduciary responsibility, transparency, because we all want a value-based healthcare system, but you can't get there when people don't know what they're paying.
Yeah.
But I'm going to put on sort of channel Darius. Darius has been sort of one of the leading voices for years on the value of innovation. I think there are problems in the industry, but I think we do lose sense of drug pricing is not out of control in aggregate.
Okay.
As Darius said, when you look at list price, that's meaningless. It's what's the net price? What are people actually paying? When I say people, employers and hospitals and others, there are egregious examples, but in broadly speaking, drug prices have not been going up that much. And when you look at consumers complain all the time, partly because of the idiosyncrasies and the unfairness sometimes of cost sharing. But on average, most consumers don't pay more than $500 a year out of pocket for drugs. And when you think about how we treat diseases today, it is increasingly, most of the innovations coming from drug therapies. And so we do lose, they're the boogeymen today, the PBMs, the pharma companies. And I think we do lose track of, broadly speaking, they innovate, the value of these products are great, and we shouldn't get too carried away. And again, just pick up the newspapers of what United Healthcare has been doing in Medicare Advantage. And
that's probably what we're not doing.
I mean, unfortunately, as Darius said, the incentives are make money in return. And so all industries are doing some things that are a little shady or maybe not in the public interest. And that's the drug industry is no different. And again, we're going to pile up on PBMs. The manufacturers do some dirty things too, right? And the PBMs are going to say, hey, wait a second. We have our formulary designed this way because the manufacturer put a gun to our head to say, don't cover that biosimilar or we're going to cut our rebate on our blockbuster drug. So the games go back both ways. But broadly speaking, I think there's been a disproportionate hysteria about drug pricing and out-of-pocket costs.
Yeah, because I mean, when you ask anybody, they would probably tell you that the drug cost has increased significantly over the years. But from what you're telling me, that's not the case. So who's saying that information that people are getting in their head that the drug costs have been increasing?
Well, spending is going up. And the issue is that there's this layer that's now being added on top of what we call the net prices. So the net prices really are what drug manufacturers are receiving on their drugs.
Okay.
But there are a lot of people feeding at this trough. Right? There are the drug manufacturers, there's the pharmacies, there's the insurers, there are the PBMs. And so you've got to add all of the layer of compensation that's going to those intermediaries. And it turns out when you do that, the picture is less sanguine for consumers. But that said, I agree with what Jeff is saying. On the large, this is a success story, that medical innovation over the past 100 years has contributed mightily to human welfare. And that's even when you account for its costs.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we were able, correct me if my pathway is wrong, but I guess it's amazing to say that the drug cost has essentially remained the same, but innovation has increased.
It's an unusual industry in the sense that I think we have this kind of implicit agreement. Okay, manufacturers, when you develop a new product, you price at the market. And hopefully PBMs are part of that market that restrains, as Darius said, tries to keep value somewhere in check. We're not going to overpay for a drug that's not that effective. But the belief is you're on patent for 10 or plus years, whatever it might be, you make your money and then it goes generic and competition comes in and prices fall dramatically. And
I see.
that's basically been the blessing and savings of this industry is drug prices have not increased that much because we have this armament of really low-cost generics that a lot of them are very effective.
Yeah.
But right now, I think there are some incentives maybe to favor a newer brand that's marginally better
I see.
than a very cheap generic.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Yes, it's marginally better. And then you as a consumer who may only have to pay another $20 copay to get the newest and best, say, give me that one. Even though from a societal perspective, the generic is a better value, for example.
Okay.
And if you were looking at it broadly from a social perspective, you would say, we're going to encourage use of the generic first and then make, if you fail on that one, then we're going to make you get the more expensive brand later. That angers consumers, that type of thing. But it is logical from a societal perspective.
I mean, it depends though. Like
Yes.
it's, as you know, and you've done work on this as well, like if you have somebody suffering from, let's say, bipolar disorder, you don't want a fail first policy there because failure there has extremely severe consequences. So there has to be some clinical context for all these discussions. But by and large, these are all reasonable strategies conceptually. That it may be the case that generics provide more value to to particular segments of the patient population. And the more we can do, by the way, to identify which patients are likely to benefit from the generics and which really need the expensive brands, which is a problem that all of us can help solve from a data analysis standpoint, that will make the system work even better.
And I mean, essentially, that's the insurance's responsibility because don't they collect data points to see what patients they have on their in their company and like what they're using and what medications they're using? So would those data points come from the insurance companies?
They often do. Medicare also has these kinds of data. I mean, we've been facing challenges, we meaning I guess all academics have been facing challenges with accessing Medicare data, that it's become in some ways more difficult to access these kinds of data.
Transparency is not a thing, I guess, in this industry because, I mean, the fact that you don't have access to those points and then, I mean, the PBMs.
Partly because of this game of list versus net price and proprietary discounts that you don't want to reveal.
I see.
So even if we get claims data, we won't get rebate data. We have to try and estimate that, or third-party vendors estimate that.
That's true. That's actually that's a really good point as well. That I mean, the claims data will tell you things about the health outcomes associated with taking a drug. But I wasn't even thinking about this other issue, which is the data we get, whether it's from Medicare or from private insurer sources, it never has the rebates because those are, double secret kinds of data points that academics don't have access to. And so therefore, they're not part of the conversation. That, one thing that's frustrating to all of us is that when we open up the newspaper and read about the latest thing that one senator or another has said, or somebody, an insurance executive or whoever has said, oftentimes they're making statements on the basis of prices that we all know are fictitious, because they don't, they may not have, or maybe they don't want to in some cases, talk about the actual post-discount net prices, and it just confuses the public policy discussion and sets us back, I think.
Yeah.
Can I add one point? People, I don't think, understand about 9 out of 10 prescriptions filled are for generic drugs. But spending on generics for our total is about 18%. So 9 out of 10 drugs are really cheap. People's cost sharing tends to be cheap. Okay, half now, more than half, are on specialty drugs, which are biologics. And again, the definition of a specialty drug differs. But that's where these transparent PBMs typically have big savings, is by restricting the use of specialty drugs. And Darius mentioned Humira, very expensive drug that extended its patent for a long time. It was a cash cow for AbbVie. These transparent PBMs come in and say, I don't think every patient needs this.
Yeah.
And so they can say, we can negotiate a 1% better rate than some other PBM or this or that. We'll be, we won't rip you off. But largely speaking, most of their savings comes from managing utilization and keeping people away from these highly rebated, high-cost drugs. And there's some pros and cons to that, but that's generally where their savings
They're not
are
always
coming.
right.
No, you're absolutely right. But they do say, we have clinicians as opposed to financial decisions making determinations.
Right. And speaking of like Humira, do you guys have any like real life examples of where PBMs had a positive role with the drugs or a specific drug class in reducing the cost, or quite the opposite?
Hep C probably, huh?
Well, I think that's a reasonable example that that in hepatitis, it's hard to know where to attribute the credit for that, but the story that Jeff is alluding to is that the novel direct-acting antivirals for hepatitis C cured the disease, in whatever it was, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. And the first drug was launched by Gilead, and it was priced, I think, $84,000, which I think was still cost-effective by most economic analyses. But there was a lot of gnashing of teeth about the price, just because it was a higher price than people wanted to pay. There's the earlier point that you'd rather buy the iPhone for $500, even if it's worth it to you at $1,000. But then I think about 9 months later, AbbVie entered with a very similar agent, another direct-acting antiviral, and the price came down by about half, I think, when you include for discounts. And it came down even more subsequently. And that was, I think, due to both the dynamics of competition between two manufacturers and also the presence of PBMs that were playing one off the other. And in the end, patients absolutely benefited from that. It's still the case that there were a lot of Hep C patients that were left untreated. So it's not like this was an unmitigated success story. But there were some clear benefits of the price competition, and the drug itself was a game changer in that disease for many, many people.
Well, I'm glad we have that example because, I mean, I hope that like kind of stops the PBM hate, because I feel like we all, think that they're the bad guy. But on a patient level, let's say that a patient, maybe someone who is like 65 and older, they've been taking this medication forever. It's been this cost for however many years. What do we do? How do we talk to patients when they come in and then, or maybe they switch insurances, whatever, they come in and that drug is now way above their cost means?
That's, I think, what some of the ire that consumers face and why it's a disconnect with the actual data of how much they're paying for drugs is they do have these examples where my drug used to cost X, now it's X plus something ridiculous.
Yeah.
Or I'm in the donut hole of Medicare Part D, and all of a sudden in the middle of the year my drug price changed dramatically.
Yeah.
Or like you say, you switch employers and that drug is not preferred or not covered by your new PBM. Again, there's no simple answer for that. We have a private healthcare system with multiple PBMs and aligned with it's employer-based. And so when you change jobs and things of that nature, you're changing insurance and all of these things happen. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But in aggregate, I think hopefully that's not frequent enough.
I mean, Jeff has pioneered an area of research that has shown just how problematic copays can be for health. That if copay, and even modest copays, can result in people not taking life-saving medication to control their cholesterol or to reduce their cardiovascular risk. So these are not just financial issues. Even though they may appear to be, they ultimately become health issues.
Yeah.
And so it's really important that copays don't prevent access.
Yeah.
And don't have negative health consequences downstream. But it is a tricky balance because copays are, in our current system, they're the lever that's used to negotiate prices, which is not ideal.
Who would be responsible for the checks and balances to ensure that the prices, the copays, are reasonable for the patients that they're treating and that they're not paying these exuberant prices and then they don't have access and then now their health is in a severe decline?
So I think, this is a hard question, but I think in principle, this is a problem that's supposed to be solved through competition. that if we were allowed to select across different PBMs and some of them were systematically better at figuring out how to provide access to your employees for the drugs that really matter, that in principle is the way this ought to work. But it's hard for that to play out when no one knows what the prices are. And there's another aspect of this too, by the way, which is the information on value is also not as readily available as it should be. That there's not as much investment in that kind of evidence, I think, that as there should be. And the ready availability of evidence on value and real, honest data on prices would go a long way towards creating an environment where a PBM could come out and say, you know what, our strategy is going to be to make sure your patients get valuable drugs. We're going to show you that they're valuable, and we're going to show you what you're paying.
In theory, integrated health plans, so a Kaiser or an HMO that's responsible for both your medical and your drug costs, have stronger incentives to make sure you take your cheap statins and antihypertensives, because if not, you end up in the hospital and that comes out of their bottom line because they're paid a capitated amount regardless, and their job is to keep you healthy. In theory, that should work. But when turnover outside of Kaiser, when turnover in health plans is every 3 years on average, hey, listen, don't take your statin. That heart attack's going to happen on someone else's dime. So the incentives aren't quite as strong. And to Darius' point, Darius has done a lot of great work in this area, but cost sharing matters, but we are even seeing now with low costs, we've been looking at low costs because so many generics are cheap now. In Medicare Part D, they're in the range of $0 to $10 for most generic drugs. And we're still seeing lots of gaps in people's use. So it's not financially driven. Part of it is I don't think there's enough education of the importance of taking that drug. Physicians and the PBMs always say, oh, we have these algorithms to catch you when you stop. That's crazy. They don't, right? That they should in theory, right? Say, hey, you haven't filled in 25 days. What's up? Right? Send you a reminder. Is there a problem? Do you want your doctor or nurse to call you?
I know CVS Caremark does that because my dad has that.
That's good. That's good. But again, sometimes we see lots of poor adherence on drugs we know are beneficial, and cost is just one of several factors, and we don't do a good job, I think, outside of financial as well.
And so let's say, for example, we have a patient who has a chronic illness and they need a medication, possibly stat. How does a pharmacist navigate that? Do they talk directly to the PBMs, or how would they get that drug maybe as investigational so that they can get treated? What goes on in that scenario?
Well, now you're opening Pandora's box. Because the poor pharmacists and pharmacies are saying, it's a competitive dog-eat-dog world. The PBMs are hammering us on margins, right? We don't have time to do real good patient care.
I would imagine, yeah.
Absolutely. And so they're stretched to keep their store open. And you hear, particularly in the independent pharmacy, saying, no, the PBMs really play hardball with us. We're happy if we get acquisition costs plus a little bit of a dispensing fee. And the belief is we have to make it up by selling diapers and all the other crap in our store. That we're not making a lot of money on drugs anymore. I
see. And so we've been talking a lot about transparency. How do you think this impacts pharmacists working within these organizations? And let me get back to this. For the PBMs, you were talking about maybe having more transparency. I'm sure it would possibly be helpful if any one of those three big, huge PBMs decided to take a huge culture shift and say, look, we're going to kind of go away from what we were originally doing and be more transparent. How would that possibly affect the field?
That's an interesting thought experiment. I think currently, it's reasonable to believe that businesses are configured to take advantage of their current strategy. So it would be probably very costly for a large organization to pivot so dramatically.
That
CEO is on LinkedIn right now.
I do. So I think that the likelihood is probably that something like that comes out of a smaller PBM that, in some ways has less to lose financially from such a significant pivot. And so there is, I think, an important role for pharmacy and pharmacists in all of this, because if you think about it, pharmacists have ground level insight into the two things that we've been emphasizing, which is one, the clinical value of the drug, and two, the cost of the drug. Now, I'm not saying that pharmacists magically know all these complicated rebates and discounts, but they actually have, among all the players, they actually have a lot of the pieces in place. And if they were given the right data tools, like actually shown costs, I think that would be the idea of pharmacist executives in these companies who were actually given a fighting chance by being given that information. That's a way to design value-based pharmacy benefits and a pricing system that really works for patients.
I see. We're almost drawing to a close, but I wanted to get both of your opinions on the future of pharmacy and what is one thing that if you could change instantly or right now, that would be a positive outcome to pharmacy, drug costs, all the things that we've talked about. What would that be?
Okay, I'm going to plunge in while Jeff ruminates and thinks about the answer. I really believe that transparency is the most important single thing. And not because I think it's a silver bullet. I don't. But I'm just thinking if I were to rank order all the things we could do to the marketplace, I just feel like that is a gate and if we can't get through that gate, we can never have a value-based system. Now, there are a lot of details that can be haggled over. What does it mean? How do we generate transparency? I don't know necessarily that we have clean answers to that. That is something that needs to be continually, discussed and worked out and researched. But I think, as Jeff and I have both emphasized, the past of pharmacy has been actually very successful. And there are good reasons to believe the future will also be equally successful because, prices have been reasonably stable with continuing improvements in innovation. If you look at it just from those two facts alone, that's great. And so simply sustaining that trajectory would be a good outcome. But I think we can do even better than that with reforms.
And if you look at statistics, so national health expenditures, which covers everything, durable medical equipment, nursing home, drugs are only about 10 or 11% of total healthcare spending. So the industry always argues, we're a small player in total healthcare costs, and yet so much of the innovation in medical care is coming from our industry. Why are you picking on us so much? And that's not a non-trivial argument. In Medicare, I think it's about 17% of seniors' spending is on drugs. And if you look at private employers, which is where I think a lot of the anger comes from, they have younger populations who don't go to the hospital very much, so drugs are 20 to 25% of their spend. So it depends on which bucket you look at. And is the glass half full or half empty if drug spending is too high or too low? But I do think we have to put it into perspective. And they're saying, why aren't you looking at the hospitals? They're a third almost of spending, right? Physicians are 21, 22% of spending. We know there's tons of waste in those sectors. Why all the emphasis on us? But again, I think it's an easy system to pick on. People interact and go to the pharmacy all the time. And like you say, the peculiarities of why is my copay $50 when it was $10 last month? Those types of things really infuriate consumers and lead to confusion and frustration.
It sounds like we have a lot of work to do with, I think, transparency and also just education on all levels. Educating the patients on what their plan looks like and actually going into detail of what this looks for you, what this means for you as someone who may have a chronic illness or someone who maybe goes to the doctor just for their checkups. So I think for me, I would say education would probably be something at the forefront on all levels that we just need an understanding of what it is, why it is, and how we can just combat that.
It's well said.
But I did want to say thank you, Dr. Joyce and Dr. Lakdawalla, for being here today. We really appreciate the conversation, and we hope everyone listening does too.